The rain came down in sheets that October afternoon, turning the dirt road into a river of mud. Thomas Garrett watched from his porch as a figure struggled up the path toward his ranch, dragging a battered suitcase through the mire. He grabbed his rain slicker and headed out, his boots squelching with each step. As he got closer, he realized it was a woman, maybe 50 years old, her clothes soaked through, her gray-streaked hair plastered to her face. He built walls around himself, brick by brick, telling himself it was easier not to feel. He worked from sunrise to sunset, ate cold beans from cans, and spoke to no one but his horses. The ranch hands he'd once employed were long gone. He managed alone because alone was safe. Margaret stayed that night in the guest room, and the next morning Thomas drove her car from where it had died on the highway. The mechanic gave bad news. Repairs would cost more than the vehicle was worth. Margaret took it with the kind of tired acceptance Thomas knew too well. Over breakfast, toast that Thomas had burned and coffee that tasted like mud, Margaret made an offer. She'd decook for him in exchange for shelter until she saved enough for a bus ticket to Bozeman. Just cooking, nothing else. She'd earn her keep honestly. Thomas looked at this stranger across his kitchen table, this woman with sadness in her eyes, and flour somehow already on her borrowed shirt, and heard himself say something that surprised them both. He'd agree, but only if she seasoned everything with laughter too. He was tired of silence. If she was going to fill his kitchen with good food, she had to fill it with sound as well. Stories, jokes, anything but the oppressive quiet he'd been drowning in. Margaret stared at him, then something shifted in her expression. She asked if he was serious. Thomas nodded, suddenly feeling foolish, but Margaret's lips curved into the first real smile he'd seen from her. She agreed, with one condition: he had to laugh back. No sitting there like a stone while she did all the work. Fair was fair. The first week was stilted. Margaret cooked meals that made Thomas remember food could be art, not just fuel. Pot roast that fell apart at the touch of a fork, bread that filled the house with warmth, apple pie that tasted like childhood. She did impressions of the grumpy hardware store owner in town that made Thomas snort coffee through his nose. Thomas found himself looking forward to meals, not for the food but for Margaret's presence. He started sharing his own stories, about the early years of the ranch, about his dreams that had died with his wife. Margaret listened without pity, only understanding. She told him about her husband Robert, about their failed attempts to have children, about how cooking had become their shared love language. 3 weeks became a month, then 2. Margaret's bus money sat in an envelope on the mantel, growing but ignored. Thomas started joining her in the kitchen, supposedly to help but really just to be near her energy. She taught him to cook properly, laughing when he measured ingredients with the precision of someone defusing a bomb. He taught her to ride horses, steadying her when she wobbled and celebrating when she finally cantered on her own. The ranch transformed. Thomas hired back some hands, suddenly wanting the property to look its best. Margaret planted an herb garden, saying every good cook needed fresh ingredients. They fell into routines that felt suspiciously like a partnership, morning coffee together watching the sunrise, afternoon rides checking fence lines, evening meals that stretched for hours as they talked about everything and nothing. One evening, as snow began to fall, Thomas found Margaret standing by the window with that envelope in her hands. She had enough now for the bus ticket and first month's rent in Bozeman. She should go start the life she'd been planning. But she turned to him with tears in her eyes and asked if he remembered their deal. Thomas nodded, his throat tight. She'd fulfilled it beautifully. Margaret shook her head. The deal wasn't complete. She'd seasoned his food with laughter and brought sound back to his silent house. But somewhere along the way, he'd done something she hadn't expected. He'd reminded her that life didn't end with loss, that joy could grow in the spaces grief left behind. He'd given her something more valuable than shelter. He'd given her a reason to laugh again, too. Thomas crossed the kitchen and took her hands. He told her he didn't want to cook anymore. He wanted a partner, someone to share the sunrise with, someone whose laughter made every meal taste better. He wanted her, if she'd stay, not as someone earning her keep, but as someone building a life. Margaret kissed him then, soft and certain, tasting like cinnamon and hope. The envelope fell to the floor, forgotten. She'd come to his ranch desperate and broken, offering the only skill she had left. But she'd discovered that the best recipes weren't measured in cups and spoons. They were measured in shared laughter and stories told across kitchen tables, in two wounded hearts learning to beat in rhythm again. They married that spring in a simple ceremony, with Margaret wearing flowers from her herb garden and Thomas unable to stop smiling. The ranch flourished under their joint care, Margaret's cooking drawing people from miles around for Sunday suppers that became legendary. Thomas learned that his wife had been right all along. Love wasn't about replacing what was lost, but about being brave enough to open your heart again. Years later, when people asked about their unusual beginning, Margaret would smile and say she'd offered to cook for shelter. Thomas would add, pulling her close, that she'd done so much more. She'd seasoned his lonely life with laughter, and in doing so, had given him the greatest gift of all, a second chance at happiness, served warm and generous, at a table that would never be silent again.